The Danube is frozen solid, and an army is about to walk across it. Not to invade, not this time, to attack the empire that thinks it has already won. Behind them lies a kingdom stripped of its fortresses, its weapons confiscated, its army broken in a summer of brutal fighting. Ahead of them lies Roman territory, thinly defended, arrogant with victory, and utterly unprepared for what's coming across the ice. The man leading this desperate gamble is a king named Decebalus. And the empire he's about to strike is not just any empire. It is Rome at the absolute height of its military machine, commanded by a general who has never lost a war in his life. By every rule of ancient warfare, this shouldn't be a contest at all. One side has more soldiers, more gold, more engineers, and more experience conquering kingdoms than any power history had yet produced. The other side has a mountain range, a curved sword built to punch through Roman shields, and a king who understands something most of Rome's enemies never grasped. You don't have to win a war against Rome. You just have to make winning cost more than Rome is willing to pay. This is the story of how that calculation played out across two brutal wars. One collapsed empire's worth of gold, and one of the strangest weapons ever fielded against the legions. Historians still argue over exactly how close. Trajan came to a catastrophic, campaign-ending disaster in the mountains of Dacia. What isn't in dispute is that the casualties from this war were severe enough that Trajan himself ran out of bandages on the battlefield, and severe enough that Rome felt compelled to redesign its helmets and build a permanent stone bridge specifically because of what happened here. It's the story of Trajan and Decebalus, and of the only kingdom in centuries that came close enough to humiliating Rome twice to make the empire remember it forever. To understand why Trajan crosses the Danube in 101 AD, you have to go back 15 years to a war most people have never heard of, fought by an emperor most people have forgotten. In the mid-80s AD, the Dacian kingdom, based in the mountains of modern Romania, did something almost no power on Rome's borders had managed in living memory. Under a king named Durrus, and then his successor Decebalus, Dacian warriors ambushed Roman forces in the mountain passes and inflicted a defeat so severe that a sitting Roman governor was killed and an entire legion standard, its eagle, was captured. To a modern audience, losing a flag might sound symbolic. To Rome, it was closer to a wound in the national soul. The eagle wasn't decoration. It was consecrated, treated as something between a religious relic and a living thing. A legion that lost its eagle was, in the eyes of Rome, a disgraced legion. The emperor at the time, Domitian, needed the bleeding to stop more than he needed a decisive victory. He was fighting wars on multiple frontiers and facing serious political instability at home. So he did something almost unthinkable for an empire that saw itself as the natural ruler of the known world. He negotiated. Rome recognized Decebalus as a client king, sent him engineers and craftsmen, and most humiliating of all, agreed to pay him an annual subsidy, essentially a bribe for peace, dressed up as diplomacy. For Decebalus, this was as close to a triumph as a smaller kingdom could realistically achieve against Rome. He had forced the most powerful military machine on the planet to treat him as an equal, to write him a check every year just to keep from provoking a second bloodletting. Rome, however, does not forget an insult like that. It simply waits for the right emperor, the right army, and the right moment to collect the debt with interest. Trajan was not a product of palace intrigue. He rose through the ranks as a career soldier, commanding troops on the actual frontiers of the empire before he ever wore the purple. He understood supply lines, siege engineering, and logistics as intimately as he understood the sword. And when he became emperor in 98 AD, the annual tribute still flowing to Decebalus wasn't just an accounting inconvenience. It was a live, ongoing reminder, broadcast across the whole empire, that Rome could be made to pay for peace instead of simply taking what it wanted. There was a second motive sitting quietly beneath the political insult, and it was, as always with Rome, about money. Dacia sat on some of the richest gold and silver deposits in Europe, buried in the Carpathian foothills. Trajan's treasury had been strained by decades of campaigns, construction projects, and now this humiliating annual payout. Ending the tribute wasn't enough. He wanted the mines that had funded it. From his mountain stronghold, Decebalus watched the diplomatic temperature shift and understood exactly what it meant. Gold had bought him peace with one emperor. It would not buy him peace with this one. There would be no treaty renewal, no quiet renegotiation. War was coming, and both men knew it with total certainty. So Decebalus did the only thing a smaller power facing an overwhelming opponent can do. He prepared to make victory as expensive as possible. Decebalus could never match Rome's numbers in open battle, so he leaned fully into the two advantages his kingdom actually possessed: brutal, funneling mountain terrain, and a weapon engineered specifically to counter Rome's greatest tactical strength. That weapon was the falx. Picture a blade nearly as long as the man wielding it, curved like a sickle, swung two-handed in a long arcing motion that comes down over the top of a Roman shield to strike the exposed neck or shoulder behind it. Roman shield wall tactics. The tight interlocking formations that had steamrolled enemies across 3 continents were not built to defend against a strike like this. In the hands of a trained Dacian infantryman, the Falx wasn't just a sword. It was a precision tool for exploiting the single biggest weakness in Rome's signature battlefield formation. Across the Carpathians, Dacian hill forts were reinforced, walls were thickened, approaches were narrowed, and supply caches were stockpiled deep in terrain. Roman engineers had never had to navigate before. Decebalus wasn't preparing to win a conventional war. He was preparing to make Rome bleed for every mile of ground it took, in the hope that the price would eventually exceed what Trajan's treasury and Trajan's patience could absorb. When Rome goes to war, it doesn't just send soldiers, it sends an entire mobile civilization, and that distinction became terrifyingly clear to anyone watching from the Dacian side of the border in 101 AD. Marching alongside Trajan's legions were surveyors plotting supply routes in real time, carpenters building bridges and siege engines on the move, and engineers whose entire job was to make the natural landscape irrelevant as an obstacle. This wasn't an army adapting cautiously to hostile terrain the way most armies do. This was a force that reshaped terrain to suit itself. Forests were cleared in days. Roads were paved behind the advancing columns so that supply wagons could follow without interruption. For generations, the Danube had functioned as Dacia's first and most reliable line of defense. Wide, fast, and cold enough to make any unsupported crossing a near-suicidal undertaking for a hostile force. Roman engineers erased that advantage in what must have felt, from the Dacian side of the river, like an impossibly short span of time. Hundreds of boats were lashed together, planked over, and transformed into a continuous pontoon bridge spanning the width of the river. What nature had taken millennia to carve into an effective barrier, Roman engineering neutralized in days. Then came the part designed to break a kingdom's morale before a single battle had even been fought. Tens of thousands of legionaries crossed that pontoon bridge in tight, disciplined formation, boots striking the planks in unison, shields catching the light in long, unbroken rows. The message to Decebalus, watching from the high ground, could not have been clearer. There was no longer any natural obstacle Rome couldn't simply build its way through. The river that had protected his kingdom for generations had just become a road. Faced with an enemy that could neutralize geography itself, Decebalus made the only strategic choice left available to him, and it was a brutal one. He ordered villages in the invasion's path burned before Roman forces could use them. Wells were poisoned to deny the advancing army easy access to clean water. Entire communities abandoned their homes and retreated deeper into the mountains, trading comfort and stability for distance and defensible terrain. This was no longer a war fought for territorial gain. From this point forward, for Decebalus and his people, it was a war fought purely for survival, and that distinction changes everything about how the rest of the conflict would unfold. There's something grim about the calculation being made here. Every Dacian commander understood that burning your own grain stores and abandoning generations of ancestral farmland isn't a tactic anyone chooses lightly. It's the strategy of a leader who has already accepted that this war cannot be won the conventional way. Through pitched battles, through holding ground, through matching Rome, strength for strength. The only remaining path was attrition. Make the campaign so expensive and so exhausting that Rome eventually decides the gold beneath the Carpathians isn't worth the price being paid for it. Meanwhile, Trajan's advance continued with the same unhurried, almost bureaucratic precision that had defined it from the start. Roman scouts methodically mapped every viable mountain pass. Supply depots were established at calculated intervals, each one stocked before the army moved beyond it, so that no Roman unit was ever more than a few days from resupply, even deep in hostile territory. This is the part of ancient warfare that rarely makes it into dramatic retellings, but it's precisely what separates an empire capable of sustained multi-year conquest from a raiding force that can win a single battle and nothing more. Decebalus wasn't just fighting Roman soldiers, he was fighting an entire administrative system, refined and tested across more than a century of continuous expansion. By the summer of 101 AD, after weeks of cautious maneuvering through difficult terrain, the two armies finally collided head-on at Tapai, a narrow mountain pass that controlled the route to the Dacian capital. Whoever held this pass held the road to Decebalus' stronghold, and both sides knew exactly what was at stake. The battle broke out beneath a violent summer storm, thunder rolling across the surrounding peaks while steel met steel in the narrow corridor below. By every surviving account, it was one of the bloodiest single engagements of the entire campaign. This is where the Falx truly announced itself as more than a regional curiosity. Roman shield wall tactics, the tightly interlocked formations that had crushed enemy after enemy across multiple continents, proved disturbingly vulnerable to a blade engineered to arc over the top of a shield and strike downward into the gap between helmet and shoulder. Dacian warriors tore openings into Roman formations that, by conventional military logic, should never have been possible to create. Rome won the field. There's no real ambiguity about that. By the end of the engagement, the legions held the pass, and Dacian forces were forced to withdraw deeper into the mountains. But the cost was staggering, far higher than Roman commanders had anticipated going in. In one of the more striking details preserved from this campaign, Trajan himself is recorded tearing strips of cloth from his own garments to bind the wounds of ordinary soldiers, because medical supplies in the field hospital had simply run out. This was not the clean, lopsided massacre an empire of Rome's scale typically expected when crushing a regional kingdom. Dacia had bitten back hard, and the legions felt it in their casualty lists. It's worth pausing on just how unusual this was. Rome had spent centuries building a reputation for grinding down enemies through sheer weight of numbers and discipline, rarely needing an emperor to personally tend to the wounded because supply had failed mid-battle. That single detail, an emperor out of bandages, tells you more about the intensity of tapai than any casualty estimate could. A weapon nobody in the Roman command structure had seriously planned around had, in a single afternoon, turned a supposedly routine punitive campaign into something closer to a near-run thing. Then, just as the campaign seemed poised to push deeper into Dacian territory and finish the job, winter arrived and did what Decebalus' army alone could not. Snow choked the mountain passes. Temperatures plummeted. Supply lines that depended on open roads and predictable weather began to seize up. Trajan, despite holding every tactical advantage on the battlefield, was forced into a pragmatic decision: halt the offensive, establish winter camps, and wait out the season. The campaign that was supposed to crush Dacia in a single summer instead ground to a frozen, uneasy stalemate. For most commanders in Decebalus' position, this pause would have been a moment to regroup quietly and hope for a better outcome in spring. Decebalus did something far bolder and far riskier. Rather than simply absorb the winter as defensive breathing room, he went on the offensive, using the very season that had stopped Trajan's advance as cover for a counterattack nobody in the Roman high command saw coming. He forged an alliance with the Roxolani, a fierce nomadic people renowned across the region for their heavily armored cavalry, warriors, and horses alike, wrapped in scale armor capable of withstanding standard infantry weapons. Together, the two forces planned something that sounds almost suicidal on paper: crossing the Danube not by boat and not by bridge, but on foot, directly across its frozen winter surface, to strike deep into Moesia, Roman territory sitting largely undefended behind the front lines, its garrisons thin to support the main campaign in Dacia. The objective wasn't symbolic revenge, it was surgical and strategic. Burn the supply depots, disrupt the grain shipments and equipment caches the legions depended on, and sever the logistical lifeline keeping Trajan's war machine fed and equipped, ideally before that machine could resume its advance once spring thawed the mountain passes. For one genuinely tense stretch of this campaign, it actually looked like it might work. Roman rear territories were caught almost completely flat-footed. Garrisons were thin, supply depots lightly guarded, and a king Roman command had already mentally filed away as defeated was suddenly burning through Roman-held land at a speed nobody anticipated. Consider what this gamble actually required. Crossing a major river on foot, across ice that may or may not hold the weight of armored cavalry, in temperatures cold enough to kill exposed soldiers within hours, all while coordinating with an allied force whose language, customs, and command structure differed from his own. This wasn't a decision made by a desperate man flailing for any option available. It was the calculated risk of a commander who understood that conventional resistance had already failed, and that only an unconventional strike, one that violated every assumption Roman commanders held about how and when wars were fought, had any realistic chance of forcing Rome back to the negotiating table. Word reached Trajan's winter headquarters that Moesia was burning. Roman commanders in the rear scrambled to organize a response to an offensive that, by every conventional rule of ancient warfare, shouldn't have been happening in the dead of winter. Trajan, notably, did not panic. He calculated that marching reinforcements overland through snow-choked terrain would take weeks Rome didn't have. Weeks that would give Decebalus and his Roxolani allies more than enough time to inflict campaign-ending damage on Roman supply infrastructure. So instead, he reached for an option very few commanders in his position would even consider viable in midwinter. He mobilized the entire Roman river fleet operating on the Danube, loaded his most experienced legions directly onto the boats, and sent them downstream at a speed no land-bound army could possibly match, even with perfect roads and ideal weather. While Decebalus and his allies were still maneuvering their forces into position deep in Moesia, fully expecting weeks of breathing room before any serious Roman response could materialize, Trajan's legions were already converging by river to intercept them. The two forces finally collided at Adamclisi in a brutal, large-scale winter engagement that would decide the fate of the entire campaign. There's no dramatic last stand here, no rousing speech before a glorious, doomed charge into history. What actually unfolds on this field is something colder and more clinical. disciplined Roman infantry forming tight and unbroken defensive lines, spears leveled in unison, absorbing wave after wave of Roxolani heavy cavalry charges with grim mechanical efficiency. Crucially, Rome had also learned something from the bloodbath at Tapai months earlier. Roman helmets deployed at Adamclisi now featured reinforced steel cross-bracing welded directly across the crown, a relatively small, unglamorous engineering adjustment specifically designed to blunt the devastating downward arc of the falx that had torn through so many soldiers in that earlier engagement. It wasn't a dramatic innovation. It didn't look heroic in any artistic rendering. But on this particular battlefield, it was the precise difference between a survivable glancing blow and a fatal strike to the skull. The combined Dacian and Roxolani strike force, already exhausted from a brutal winter river crossing, and now facing a Roman army that had specifically adapted its equipment to counter their best weapon, began to break apart under sustained pressure. Formation cohesion collapsed. Cavalry charges that should have overwhelmed Roman lines instead splintered against disciplined spear walls. Decebalus's boldest, riskiest gamble of the entire war, the one move that genuinely had the potential to change everything, ended in total defeat. What makes Adamclisi so significant isn't simply that Rome won, it's the manner in which Rome won. There's no single dramatic turning point here, no individual act of heroism that swings the battle. Instead, the engagement was decided by a series of small, almost invisible advantages stacking on top of each other. Slightly better protected helmets, slightly faster river transport, slightly more disciplined formations, holding under cavalry pressure until those incremental edges compounded into total tactical dominance. With his strike force at Adamclisi shattered and the bulk of his fighting capacity destroyed, Decebalus had nothing meaningful left to continue the war with. By 102 AD, the same king who had once forced an emperor to pay him annual tribute, the same king who had humiliated Rome so badly it took 15 years to fully respond, was finally forced to negotiate from a position of total weakness. The surrender terms were humiliating by deliberate design, not by accident. Dacian fortresses across the kingdom were systematically dismantled, their defensive value stripped away stone by stone. Weapon stockpiles, including significant quantities of the very falx blades that had caused Rome so much grief at Tapai, were surrendered. Roman garrisons were installed directly inside. What remained of Dacian territory, transforming a once independent kingdom into a closely monitored client state, watched constantly for any sign of renewed defiance. Back in Rome, this was celebrated as a major triumph, but crucially, not yet as the final end of Dacia. The War of 101 to 102 AD had broken Decebalus, forced his submission, and stripped his kingdom of much of its military strength, but Rome had not yet absorbed Dacia completely. That final chapter would only come after a second war, one that Decebalus himself would help provoke. Stripped of his army, his fortresses, and most of his weapons, but crucially not stripped of his pride or his resentment, Decebalus spent the following years quietly rebuilding wherever Roman oversight allowed him room to maneuver, recruiting fresh fighters, repairing what fortifications he could, and waiting for the moment Rome's attention would inevitably drift elsewhere across its sprawling, overstretched borders. Roman sources accuse him of violating the terms of the peace, sheltering Roman deserters, raiding neighboring tribes under Roman protection, and rearming in defiance of the treaty. Whether reluctant self-preservation or open defiance, the result was the same. Within 3 years, that unextinguished resentment reignited one final catastrophic war between the two powers. This time, Trajan had no intention of relying on temporary pontoon bridges made from lashed-together boats. He commissioned the architect Apollodorus of Damascus to build the single greatest stone bridge the ancient world had ever seen, a permanent, monumental crossing over the Danube engineered specifically to ensure Rome never had to fight this exact campaign twice, regardless of season or ice. Nearly a mile long, supported on massive stone and timber piers, it was an engineering statement as much as a military one. This river will never protect you again. The Second War, fought in 105 and 106 AD, was a different kind of conflict from the first. Decebalus, without the fortresses or the false stockpiles of a few years earlier, resorted to increasingly desperate measures. Roman sources describe a plot to have deserters assassinate Trajan directly, an attempt that failed and only hardened Roman resolve to finish the job completely, rather than negotiate a third time. Roman legions pushed methodically into the Dacian heartland, besieging and eventually capturing the capital, Sarmizegetusa Regia, after a siege that involved cutting off the city's water supply and starving out its defenders. Facing total defeat, and almost certainly a humiliating captivity and death in a Roman triumph parade, where captured enemy kings were traditionally paraded through the streets before execution, Decebalus took his own life rather than be captured. A famous relief on Trajan's column depicts the moment, the Dacian king, cornered by Roman cavalry, choosing death on his own terms over Roman chains. With Decebalus dead and organized resistance broken, Rome annexed Dacia outright, transforming it into a Roman province rich in gold, timber, and farmland. Roman colonists, veterans, and administrators poured in. Sarmizegetusa was refounded as a Roman city. The gold mined from Dacia's Carpathian deposits became a significant component of Roman currency for generations, precisely the prize Trajan had set out to seize when the annual tribute to Decebalus first became intolerable to him. To commemorate the conquest, Trajan raised one of the most extraordinary monuments the ancient world ever produced. Trajan's column, still standing in Rome today, its carved marble spiral roughly 190 feet long, if you were to unwind it into a single continuous frieze. It doesn't celebrate a single battle. It turns the entire war, the river crossings, the mountain marches, the sieges, the submissions, into stone, an empire narrating its own machinery of conquest for anyone who cared to look up. Roman soldiers appear again and again building roads, ferrying supplies, and constructing fortifications, a quiet acknowledgement, intentional or not, that engineering had been just as central to this victory as combat. So why does this story end the way it does? Why does a genuinely courageous people, led by a king who understood guerrilla warfare and psychological pressure better than almost any of Rome's other adversaries, ultimately lose twice? Because in total war waged at imperial scale, raw courage alone cannot outlast superior engineering and logistics. Rome didn't simply outfight Dacia on the battlefield. It systematically outbuilt Decebalus at every stage of the campaign. A river that should have functioned as an unbreakable natural wall became, in a matter of days, a fully functional highway the moment Roman engineers decided it would be. A brutal winter that should have bought Decebalus crucial breathing room instead became the exact season Trajan exploited, using his river fleet to outmaneuver an enemy that assumed no Roman response was possible until spring. Rome treated the natural world as a tool to be reshaped according to military necessity. Dacia, for all its genuine bravery and tactical creativity, remained constrained by it. That's the core lesson buried inside this entire conflict. This isn't simply a story of overwhelming strength crushing underdog weakness. It's a story of improvisation, colliding head-on with infrastructure. A kingdom fighting desperately for its own survival against an empire that had already, centuries earlier, industrialized the entire process of waging war. Every moment where Dacia genuinely threatened Rome's plans, the Falks tearing through shield walls at Tapai, the daring winter strike into Moesia, was eventually neutralized not by superior Roman bravery, but by superior Roman preparation. Reinforced helmets engineered in direct response to a single battle's casualty reports, a river fleet repurposed within days to counter a threat nobody anticipated arriving in midwinter. A permanent stone bridge built so the empire would never again be at the mercy of the season. Decebalus needed every one of his tactical innovations to work perfectly, indefinitely against an opponent that only ever needed to solve each problem once. That asymmetry, not courage, not even numbers, is what actually decided the fate of Europe's deadliest river. And it's why, 2,000 years later, we're still talking about the one kingdom that came close enough to make an empire flinch. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe for more stories of ancient wars, impossible, defenses, and the brutal decisions that changed history. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.